you breathe air, and most people I know do breathe air, then that makes you part of the environment. And if you're concerned about that clean air, that air and it being clean, I would consider you an environmentalist. If you drink water, and most people I know drink water, and if you're concerned about what's in the water, I would consider you an environmentalist. And if you eat food, and most people I know eat food, and if you're concerned about what's in the food, I would consider you an environmentalist. If you answer 2 out of 3, I say you're an environmentalist, you just may not know it.
Und mehr von diesem Mann gibt's jetzt.
Neon Green Network begrüßt den Soziologen und Father of Environmental Justice, Dr. Robert Bullard.
Good evening. My name is Robert Bullard. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I've been black most of my life. Today, I'd like to speak with you about one of my favorite topics. I think the title, Climate Change and Vulnerability in the United States, Talking Clean and Acting Dirty. That's a topic, a title of a paper that I wrote because there is so much talk about the United States moving to a green and clean economy. And at the same time, there was so much activity around placing the dirty, nasty stuff that other people don't want in poor communities, in working class communities, and communities of color. So I'm going to connect the dots. I'm very good at it. I like writing. I like writing books. And I've written 18 books, but it's just one book, but don't tell anybody. The central theme of all those books include fairness, justice, and equity, whether it deals with issues around housing, fair housing, transportation, just transportation, energy, whether it deals with issues around health, smart growth, or disaster response. All of them deal with justice. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental laws, housing, transportation, civil rights laws, human rights. I'm giving you the U.S. perspective, but a lot of the work that I do connect with much of the issues that are in the global South. So when we talk about the environment, for decades, the environment in the U.S. was defined as something out there, something in the wildlands, the wilderness, something away from cities and urban places. So what the environmental justice movement did is to redefine what environmentalism is. The environment is where we live, work, play, worship, where we learn, as well as the physical and natural world. But we all know that all environments are not created equal. There are some that are more equal than others. In the United States, the most potent, the most powerful predictor of health is what your zip code is. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you how healthy you are based on data. We all know that wealth and health are correlated. The poorest people within the U.S. also have the worst health and the most degraded environment. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about basic human rights. And when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about protecting the most vulnerable environments, communities and populations that have contributed least to the problem, but feel the raft and feel the negative impacts first, worst, and longest. So when we talk about, this is a map of the U.S., and the dark areas represent the best zip codes. The darker the area, the best. The lighter areas represent the worst. you'll see a pattern. This is the U.S., and you take that mental map. Here's the U.S. and the racial and ethnic composition. The dark blue, in some cases, I was told that that's purple. I told people I don't have a PhD. I have a PhD in sociology, not Crayola. I don't know if that translates. Crayola is crayon for kids. Anyway, the dark blue area, shaded area, along the southeast, southern, southwest coast, and going across, that represents the population that's people of color. African Americans, Native Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and Latinos, Hispanics. That map will be changing dramatically over the next 3 decades. As a matter of fact, it's predicted by 2042, the United States will be majority people of color. Majority people of color. Those demographics are really shaping the political landscape. They're also shaping policy, how we respond to environmental issues, and particularly how we respond to energy issues and issues related to climate. If you look at that heavy blue area, by 2060, the U.S. will have a significant majority people of color. Now, I probably won't be around in 2060, but the demographics will change. The United States is divided into regions: the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. And there will be some unique kinds of issues that will be dealt with in this region of the country. Now, this is California. A lot of good stuff come out of California and generally come this way. I live in this state. Texas is like a country. And so when you start looking at these issues and problems and challenges and who is taking the lead, and particularly when we talk about climate change, we consider climate change the #1 environmental justice issue of the century in the U.S. as well as abroad. And where you live and your income and your lack of access to things that make you healthy, they all go into making what we call social vulnerability, the ability to bounce back after a disaster, natural or man-made. We call that resilience. And so when we talk about the fact that there is an issue of responsibility, 80% of Americans have been impacted by some extreme weather event or disaster since 2007. We do have climate change, even though there are some of our elected officials who hold high offices still say climate change is not real, is a hoax, even when they face the reality. Here's a map of the population of adults who are worried about global warming and climate change. And as you move toward the red, or as you move down toward the light blue or whatever, those are the doubters. Those are the people who don't accept climate change. You can just, that gray area, you can see there is a significant portion of the U.S. population who say that they are not sure. They live in what we call the state of denial, who don't believe. If you look at this map, these are the governors in the states. We have 50 states, and there are governors over states that don't believe, or non-believers. There's a regional bias. If you look across, keep these maps in mind. Heavy red, shaded. Red also correlates with red states, blue states. Red states in the U.S. are very conservative, mostly Republican. Blue states are Democrat. Average monthly bill. Which states have the highest electric bill? Well, which would you guess? It's hot down south in electricity and air conditioning. These are the states who doubt there's climate change. These are states who don't believe in environmental regulations, and you'll start seeing a pattern. States with the highest electric bill, like Texas and Louisiana, and you start going across here. You're going to start seeing gross national GDP percentage spent on power. Look at the red. States with the renewable energy standards. These are the states, green is good, white is bad. That's not racial. Look at the states where there is no renewable energy portfolio, high concentration in the southern states. Oklahoma, yellow, they're thinking about it. States that do not have climate adaptation plans. Look where the green is. Green is good, yellow is better, white is bad. These are states not even thinking about climate adaptation. The most vulnerable region of the country in terms of climate change. This is according to the National Climate Assessment Report, 2014. The southern United States, the southeast United States is very vulnerable to climate change. If you talk about the ratio of disasters, the southern United States have a ratio of 4 to 1. There are 4 times more disasters that occur in the region where there are doubters than any other parts of the country. The southeast part of the United States experienced from 1980 to 2012 had more billion-dollar, that's with a B, disasters than other regions of the country. Here are the doubters. My state. I'm sorry, Texas. Any Texans in the room? Good. You can look at this region. This region of the country is very vulnerable, but yet still you have a population that are saying, well, we don't believe in climate change. And we don't need a clean energy plan. We don't need a climate adaptation plan. The southern United States, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of problems related to sea level rise, all the data, all the statistics, all of the documentation is in. So it's almost like, well, you got problems and you got refusal. And so the environmental justice and climate justice people are asked this simple question: will the government respond to climate change be fair? That's the climate justice question of the century. And we say, well, we got lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina. This August 28th, we'll be coming up on 10 years after Hurricane Katrina. And so that question was asked, well, was the response to Hurricane Katrina and the disaster that happened in terms that ensued because of the breach in the levees? They fired all the black school teachers, all the doctors couldn't return because they tore down the hospitals, and black homeowners did not get their settlements. New Orleans public housing, all the public housing was torn down. Black fishermen and oystermen, Vietnamese fishermen, they did not get complete settlements. So there has been a history of unfairness when it comes to responding to disasters and protecting the most vulnerable population. We saw the flooding. We saw the pictures flash before our eyes. This was not in some third world country. This was in one of the richest countries in the world. And we saw the flooding and we saw the response, and the levees were breached. The communities that were protected before the storm and the communities that were protected after the storm, the communities that was most vulnerable are most vulnerable today after billions and billions of dollars have been spent. So when we talk about moving to green energy and clean energy, it is more talk. We still have almost 67% of the energy consumption fossil fuels. So moving to green, we're moving to green, but it's not that swift. There's the coal-fired power plants. If we look at the geography of dirty industry, people of color are more likely to live within 30 miles of these power plants. We live closest to these plants, and we pay more for our electricity. We're more likely to have problems when it comes to health. We're more likely to have our property values lowered because of these. Dirty coal plants are creating tremendous problems. So when Sierra Club and other environmental groups talking about moving away from coal, we say, woohoo. We say, yeah, we say great. Because in some cases, people are shouting and support, not necessarily based on their being an environmentalist, card carrying, because of the impact that these plants are having on their communities. And so when we talk about the impact, we talk about moving to dirty coal, moving away from dirty coal, and there is no such thing as clean coal. Nothing. There's no such thing. And so when we look at where the coal plants are, where they proliferate, and we look at the impact of who lives near these polluting facilities, whether it's power plants, or whether it's refineries, or whether other kinds of dirty industries. In 1970, blacks are 79% more likely to live in communities where there's a health risk from these facilities. This is in 19 states, 19 out of 50 for blacks, 12 out of 50 for Hispanics, and 7 out of 54 for Asians. And you say, we ask the question, who lives next to the most dangerous facilities? This is a map. You don't fight, you don't get in the queue, you don't get in line to live next to one of these facilities. And the most vulnerable population that are impacted by this are children. 1/3 of all children, school children in the US live near these major facilities that are part of this chemical catastrophe zone. If you look at the most vulnerable, as I said before, you look at the health cost related to living in these areas. The Center for Disease Control estimates that $56 billion in medical costs alone due to asthma, contributing to these facilities and also in terms of our transportation, in terms of dirty fossil fuel burning cars. The problem ends up in low-income African American Latinos are more likely to die from asthma and respiratory illnesses or being sent to the hospital. When we talk about living on the fence line with oil companies, this is not theory. If you look at where the largest refineries are in the United States, we have a high concentration in this area here. This is the Gulf Coast. This is Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, along this coast. These are the same areas that say there's no climate change, there's a relationship between energy production and environment. But you look at the refineries. This is a picture I took in a community called Norco, Louisiana. It was founded right after slavery on a plantation where blacks bought the plantation. It's sandwiched between two shell refineries, not one, two. The community of Norco is the meat between the sandwich. For you vegetarian, it's the tofu between the bread. You can see the community. You stand there 15 minutes, everybody, it smells like you're pumping oil on the ground. Everybody has asthma. This is another community in Louisiana. Playgrounds across from refineries. Contradiction. This is in Corpus Christi, Texas. This is in Baytown, Texas. One of the largest refineries. ExxonMobil is across the street from a park and a public housing development. This is the line of the ExxonMobil of the XL pipeline, Keystone, coming from Alberta, and the end up would be in two communities, Houston and in Port Arthur. Houston and in Port Arthur, Texas. It would be in Houston and Manchester, in a mostly Latino neighborhood, where parks across from refineries. This is the refinery that would actually refine the dirty tar sand oil. This is in Houston. This is a high school that's located across from the refinery. This is madness. Houston does not have zoning. It does not have planning. It has what's called unrestrained capitalism. You have the money, you can do it. This is in West Port Arthur, Texas. This is the mostly African American community where the XO pipeline spur would actually end up in Port Arthur. This is a black neighborhood that is very poor. There's refineries all around. Motiva, one of some of the largest refineries across from a public housing project. So the politics of place and the place of politics. Red states, blue states. This is a red state, blue state map of the election in 2012 wherein President Obama won. Keep this map in mind. Look at the red toward the bottom. This is the ideology. This is a Gallup poll that rated most conservative. Red and pink, most conservative. Look where the most conservative states are. This is the high concentration of poverty. Look at the heavy blue concentration across the bottom of the state, of the United States. Florida is light blue. Florida is different. It just sticks out in a lot of ways. Sticks out in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. This is a map of the worst health departments. The bottom percentile, dark blue. This is the worst place to be a child, yellow. Look at that light area across the southern part. You can draw a line across where children are impoverished. Children have lots of problems in terms of getting access to quality education, health care, et cetera. This is a map of high concentration of disease. We call this the disease belt. This is heart disease, heavy red. This is the stroke belt. High concentration, the purple represents high concentration of people who are having strokes. Look at this geographic concentration. This is the diabetes belt, heavy red. People are sick, they're dying. This is a cancer belt, heavy brown. This is the uninsured belt, where people have the highest concentration of uninsured. Look across. This is the blue areas represent the states that sued the federal government and laws that said Obamacare is unconstitutional. Look at those states. Poor, sick, well, doesn't make sense. These are the states, these are the states that said we will not get Medicaid, pass a law to get health care for poor people. Let the poor people in our states die. Look at the same states. Here is the red areas, the high concentration of uninsured. And I flip back. Look what Obamacare has done for some of those states that said we will take it. Yellow represents states' improvements, yellow to green. Obamacare has turned red in terms of high concentration of uninsured. They've changed colors. So when we talk about sustainable communities in the era of climate change, and we talk about what strategies communities are using, we say that sustainability must address equity and social inequality. For example, when you look at the map, literally look at those maps and see that how people align themselves on social issues impact their willingness to move the environmental lever over to sustainability and progressive decision making when it comes to health and housing and voting and et cetera. And so we say that there can be no sustainable, livable America without addressing long-standing inequality that has been swept under the rug for years and for decades. So the issues now in terms of research, we have lots of research showing that the rising inequality in our country, the rising poverty in our country, and particularly child poverty. We're talking about the fact that we do not have a livable wage in our country. We have what's called a minimum wage. Minimum wage is not livable. We have many millions of Americans working 2 minimum wage jobs and still are below poverty when it comes to that threshold. So we have a widening wealth gap, health gap, and income gap. And what's important to recognize and understand is that this wealth gap, we're talking about transformative wealth. One generation passing off wealth to the next generation, so that the preceding generation does not have to start off with zero. You have something to start off with. It's becoming more difficult for individuals in our society to move beyond the position or the station of their parents. We say upward mobility used to be the American dream, but that dream has not actually, there's a ceiling. And so when we talk about addressing equity and addressing this inequality, these are prerequisites for achieving sustainability. We have many of our most sustainable cities in America, and we can call off some of the names like Portland and Seattle and San Francisco. These communities are not diverse. They do not reflect the demographics of the country. And in many cases, they're very expensive to live in. What we're saying is that going green and creating sustainable communities and livable communities should not somehow preclude the entry of low-income families, working-class communities, and even middle-class communities. In some of our cities, from Boston to San Francisco, it's becoming more difficult for middle-income people to live in the city. And so addressing equity and addressing these long-standing problems and issues that have, as I said before, that have festered, and in some cases, they have gotten worse because of the fear of the changing demographics of our country, and because many of the states that are red states are now becoming purple, that is swing states, and are on the verge of becoming blue in terms of having a majority of people who are people of color and the majority of people who vote Democrat. Now that scares a lot of people, so all kinds of obstacles are being placed in the way of a democratic process or participatory democracy, making it harder to vote, voter ID, changing the way voting is done in many districts in terms of no early voting, no Sunday voting, and changing the way you can actually register to vote, voter intimidation at the polls, poll watchers. Those are things that are designed to suppress the vote. And what we're saying is that if we are to be a true democracy, we should make voting easier. We should be encouraging people to participate in the democratic process. I'm very hopeful and optimistic because of young people, because of students, because they're a generation that really doesn't have the same baggage on board as many individuals in my generation. So in terms of progressive politics, and in terms of moving the envelope when it comes to climate issues, I think that we will have more mobilization occurring when those organizations, those mainstream, traditional conservation and environmental organizations realize that if they want to grow and prosper in the future, they have to diversify. They have to do a little color coordination. They have to do a better job in attracting diverse individuals, and the population that's the emerging majority, that's the population from which they should draw. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you. Do I sit?
Dr. Bullard, do you think that awareness would grow more quickly if environmental justice, in fact, was a human and constitutional right in the US? Like, you know, the right to free speech should have a right to an uncorrupted environment that doesn't make you sick. Would that make quick change, it easier to change?
I think that it would make it much easier to have standing in our courts if there was an environmental justice law. There is no law. And I think it would make it easier if people would realize that these are the rights that we're talking about are basic human rights, and they are not they're not something that we're asking for that can be equated with, oh, we want affirmative action. The right to breathe is not affirmative action. Most of us don't decide next Tuesday I'm not going to breathe. These are basic rights. These are human rights, and when we start elevating them to that level on the global scene, I think there's a level of embarrassment that's made when the United States starts to talk about human rights violations on these other countries. We have to also turn the lens back on ourselves.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.